Okay, you have to pretend this is an hour-long sermon.
I'm just going to wait till this is actually until you start, and then I'm going to say.
Okay.
Or you can just tell me when I say 6:30.
Okay. Glory to Jesus Christ. Good evening. So for those who are logging on, I'm Father Christopher Zuger, and you're on the Our Perpetual Help YouTube channel. You will be able to ask questions by posting them on the page, or the people here can ask when I'm done. Because if you ask questions and I try to answer them while I'm doing this, I'll end up going off on a completely different tangent and we'll never get done. So the goal is tonight we're going to cover Catholic rescuers in the Holocaust. This program's going to run about 1 hour, and then questions at the end. So the big question is, why do this? I've done these classes for an adult ed program here in Albuquerque for a while, and the role of Catholics and what happened to the Jews in occupied Europe during World War II has always been a popular topic, if you can say popular, about a tragedy like the Holocaust. But the main things are these. Why do this? There's lots of disinformation about what Catholics did and did not do to help Jews during the war. And it's an easy stereotype to say nobody in Poland saved Jews, even though Poland was a mostly Catholic country. Or why didn't the church protest more loudly, which we're going to actually touch on tonight. So that's some of the stuff I'm going to be dealing with. Focusing on Poland and France and a little bit in Italy. The Raoul Wallenberg Foundation is named for Raoul Wallenberg, a famous Swedish diplomat who worked in Hungary in the last year of the war to save Jewish lives. It was specifically why he went to Budapest, to the capital of Hungary. And in Hungary, he was instrumental, along with other diplomats and lay people and priests and nuns, in saving probably at least 30 to 50,000 Jewish lives. And they have a program they call Houses of Life. They go around Europe marking a building where Jews were hidden. And they came out with this statement last year that the vast majority of the places that they mark as a house of life were Catholic monasteries, convents, schools, and homes belonging to Catholics who were active in various networks to try and save Jewish lives. So right there tells us right away that a lot of Catholics were active in rescue work. Pope Pius XII is a separate topic and tends to be an object of controversy. And if there's interest on doing that, I can. That would be probably a 2-night topic, because I have a lot of material. And I have a lot of answers to common comments about the Pope, such as he was Hitler's Pope, which is not true. And this is probably one of the biggest things. We have a resurgence of anti-Semitism again in the world, of blaming Jews for many things. I actually heard someone claim that the coronavirus was invented by a Jew. That kind of nonsense. And there's a lot of denial of the Holocaust, that it ever happened, or that not that many people were killed, that no one was really killed. One gentleman actually told me that all the Jews disappeared because they were relocated into Siberia. Really? But people can believe just about anything. So it's really important to know what did happen and why it happened. So this is Europe at the furthest extent of Nazi rule. So the bright red is territory they had occupied, right? When they got almost to the gates of Moscow. So all of the bright red, okay, was German ruled. And then the lighter color countries were allies of Germany and or Italy. Italy was in the war until 1943, and they pulled out in September of 43. But this is the furthest extent it goes. Now, deportations of Jews and persecution of Jews took place everywhere. There was no region that was exempt from that. Hitler was determined after October 1941 to wipe out the Jewish population of Europe. And it was very much a racial war, which I think people tend to forget. So Nazi regulations in Western Europe, okay, so in places like Belgium, Holland, Denmark, Norway, and parts of France and Italy, when they started picking up Jews and deporting Jews, in Western Europe, the punishment for someone who was involved in rescuing Jewish people or hiding Jewish people, and they were caught by the Gestapo or the local police, because in all of those countries, the local police collaborated with the Nazis in rounding up Jews and putting them on the trains going to the camps. This was the kind of punishment you would get. You would be arrested, put in prison. You could be sent to a concentration camp. You could end up in jail. You could lose your property. Very rare in the West that you were shot, unless you were involved in a larger resistance network and that they were trying to break. Now, in Poland, it was much different. What is called here the general government of Poland. It was, and the territory that was Poland in 1939, it was much different because National Socialism was a racial war. The Germans and Aryans were on top. And Aryans were people who came from the right blood, all right, which was Northern Europeans. The Slavs were low on the scale. And in Poland, if you were caught, the rescuer's family, everyone living in the building, like an apartment building in a city, or everyone on the farm was shot or hanged, including all of the children of any age. They would wipe out an entire village. They would burn the village to the ground. They would even kill all of the livestock. And there were signs posted throughout occupied Poland telling you not to help anybody who was Jewish. And this is what would happen to you. And it even said, even if you give a glass of water to a Jew who's trying to escape, the penalty is death. It was the only place in Europe where any assistance whatsoever of any kind would result in the death penalty. And on such a huge scale, where you're dealing with not just the rescuer, but anyone he was connected to, and people who had no idea of what was going on, such as in an apartment building. So Joseph and Victoria Ulma, if you're in Albuquerque watching this, Father Michael Niemczak, a lot of you know, these people were his father's cousins. Joseph Ulma was a farmer in a small village in Poland. And he and his wife, Victoria, they had 8 children. She was pregnant at the time that they were caught. They hid 8 Jews from 3 different households. The Nazis started departing the Jews from their village of Markova, shot a number of them in the village, and there were different families in Markova who took in Jewish neighbors. Now, this one man took in a couple, and then as the war dragged on and as people were being executed, he wanted money from them, and they were out of money. And he therefore told them to sign over all their property to him. And they wouldn't do that, and so he threw them out. And they fled to the Ulma's farm, and Joseph and Victoria took them in. That same man went to the Gestapo and denounced the Ulmas for hiding Jews on their farm. And he went with what they called the Blue Police and the soldiers to the farm. All of the people were found, the 8 Jewish people that were hiding on the farm. All of the Jewish people were shot, and then the parents were shot with the pregnant mother was killed as well, and then all of the children were shot. And there were witnesses that they had lined up to see what would happen to the Jews and to the Ulmas. And the warning was to everybody who was there, this is what will happen to you. Miraculously, the rest of the families in Martykova were never denounced, and the Jews that they hid survived the war. But that's the kind of thing that people were up against in Eastern Europe. Now, they're up for beatification, to become blessed, right? Their cause was introduced in Rome, and they are now servants of God. So why? Because they hid a Jewish family? No, because you would have thousands of Catholics being proposed for beatification. It's for these reasons. They lived their lives according to the Beatitudes before the war. They were very well known as a devout family, as a religiously active family, and as a very good family, and they were willing to do anything for anyone, and they really were living out their faith before the war came. They also symbolized at least 5,000 known Polish citizens who were recognized by Yad Vashem in Israel. Yad Vashem is the organization in Israel that recognizes a Gentile person of any religion or no religion who's not Jewish, who rescued at least one Jewish person and did so as an act of charity. They did not do it like that man, to get property or money. They did it in order to help people. There were lots of Polish families executed for hiding Jews. The death scale is quite large. But there's about 5,000 who are known. Why the others are not listed in Yad Vashem is because the rule in Yad Vashem is the rescued person has to submit the names of the rescuer. And if everybody has been killed, then there's nobody to submit the name. And they also represent, all of these unknown helpers. And we had a lady in our parish named Maria Rybenczuk, used to sit right up in here. She sat in the third pew every Sunday. And she lived outside of a town called Kolomia, which is now in Ukraine, but then was part of Poland. And when, in the 1939, they were temporarily in the Soviet Union, as you'll see in a minute. And when the Nazis invaded in 41 and started killing Jews, a man that she worked for came to her and asked, would she help hide him and his family? She had a farm that was right on the edge of the forest, and so she took him and his family into the forest, and they dug a bunker, and that's where she put all of them. And then after her family went to bed, she would cook kosher food on the stove, and Mr. Stadler would come and collect the food late at night. She never told her family what she was doing because she didn't want them to know. And one of the reasons she did this was, one, she knew the Stadlers very well. She had worked for them. They'd been very good to her. Second thing was, when the Soviets came in 39, she, her husband, and her son were to be deported to Siberia. And they were arrested, taken to the train yard, and when they got there, she prayed all the way to Our Lady, asking Our Lady to save them. And when they got to the train yard, the German soldiers said, why are you here? Your name's not on the list. Get out of here. And they went back to their farm. And so she did this act of rescue as thanksgiving to God for having saved them all. And she kept them there safely. One of the members of the family passed away. She had to bury the lady deeper in the forest, and they survived. When the Russians came back in 44 and 45, the Rybenczuks had to leave because they knew they would be on a list for sure this time. And they got a letter later through the Red Cross that the Stadlers the rest of the family had survived. But see, there was nobody to report it because then they were behind the Iron Curtain. So nobody could ever write to Yad Vashem for them. But there were so many people like that that we'll never know. We'll never know about them. And the risks they took, the great risks they took. Okay, so protest. Why wasn't there great big public protests, by the Catholic Church against the Nazis and what they were doing? This is one of the prime reasons why. In 1942, Holland was under Nazi occupation. They announced that they would be deporting Jews to the east. People didn't know yet about the death camps, but no one came back. So there was a lot of suspicion as to what was going on. This is Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. Her maiden name before she became a Carmelite nun was Edith Stein. This is her sister Rosa. She became a Catholic in Germany in 1933, and then she entered the Carmelite monastery. The nuns moved her to Holland because in the First World War, Holland was not occupied, and they thought that she and her sister, who had also converted, would be safe there. Edith Stein was famous in Germany. She was a very well-known lecturer and philosopher. She was a very popular speaker until the Nazis silenced her. So the bishops of the Catholic Church, the Reformed Church, and the smaller Protestant churches went to the ruler, Seyss-Inquart, in Holland and told him that they were going to issue a public protest at all the churches on a Sunday about the deportation. And he said, if you say nothing, I will spare the Jews who were baptized. And the cardinal in Utrecht said no. The Protestant churches went along with it, and they would not release the letter of protest. The Catholic bishops released it, and it was read in all the parishes on this particular Sunday. And the result was the following Sunday, early in the morning, the Gestapo showed up at the home of every Jewish Catholic in Holland, at monasteries, at convents, at private homes, because all the people of Jewish descent had been registered in 1941. And they took them all and put them on a train. The youngest was 5 months old. A large number were monks and nuns, and they all went to Auschwitz, and they were all gassed when they got there. And Pius XII was told about this, and he was planning a more blunt protest than anything he had done before. And when they came into the Vatican and told him what had happened in Holland, that all of these people had been taken, he burned his protest. And what the churches learned was the Nazis really didn't care, because afterwards they took all the Protestant Jews anyway. So nobody was saved unless they found a hiding place. So that's why churches ended up stopping protests by 1942 after that disaster. So Nazi camps in Poland, why? People have a terrible habit of saying Polish death camps. They're not run by Poles. It was one of the few countries where you could not get a collaborator to work in a concentration camp or a Nazi prison. Poland had a really strong underground, and they put out notices when the Nazis began advertising for guards in the camps that anyone who applied for a job like that would be shot by the underground. But this is why. There were 3 million Jews in pre-war Poland. There's 1/3 of the Jewish population of Europe. The train networks across Poland interconnected with Central and Western Europe, which made it very easy for deportation, for these long trains of boxcars to be shunted up to the gates of these camps. The camps were originally built as labor camps, as well as extermination camps for the Poles. This is where the educated upper classes were taken, a lot of the nobility, priests, nuns, officers from the army, people who were leading the resistance, Boy Scouts and Girl Guides, anybody who could take a leadership position in Polish society, who would stand up to the Nazi plans for Poland. That's who first went to Auschwitz. That was the first camp that was built, and it was built for Poles. So, because it was a racial war. Hitler wanted the Jews out of Europe originally. He just wanted them all out of the continent, and then they decided to kill them off. But when they planned the invasion, Hitler had a meeting with all his generals, and he told them that at the invasion they were to destroy the Polish nation. And when the generals protested that that would be a war crime, and how could they slaughter civilians, he said this great quote, "Who remembers the Armenians?" The Armenian genocide of 1915-1922 in the Ottoman Empire and the Republic of Turkey. Because already by 1939, nobody was talking about what had been done to the Armenians. And he firmly believed that nobody would ever talk about what they did to the Poles and ultimately what they did to the Jews. which is really what some people would want today. So they didn't resist him. This is one of the worst signs of how corrupt the German people had become, that the generals, the SS, the Wehrmacht leaders, the army, they all went along with this. They went in and they were massacring all these different Polish classes of people, deporting Poles and Jews out of their homes. It was it was awful. September 1st, of course, is when Germany invades Poland from the west. September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded from the east due to the Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement that they had. The deal with England and France was when Germany attacked Poland, England and France were supposed to attack Germany from the west, and the Poles were supposed to retreat south and to the city of Lviv, and they would hold out there, and the government would move from Warsaw to Lviv while they waited for the British and French to attack the Germans from the west, and that would force the Germans to stop the war. And the British and French did nothing until they were attacked in the summer of 1940. They abandoned Poland completely. So this is what happens to Poland. It's partitioned into 3 sections. This is the dividing line. There's the city of Lviv. Mrs. Rybenczuk was from down here, around Kolomia. So the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany split the country in half. The Danzig Free State up here and the territories that had been Western Poland were annexed into Germany, which included the town that we know as Auschwitz. And Poles and Jews from the annexed territories were dumped into this region that was called the General Government. This was Soviet until June 22nd, 1941, when Hitler tore up the agreement he had and launched a surprise attack against the Soviet Union. And after that, then the rest of Poland comes completely under Nazi rule. So, challenges of rescue. It was hard to do. You had to have a lot of courage, number one. There was danger from denouncement. Anybody could denounce you to the Gestapo or the local police if your police department was collaborating with the Nazis, which in Western Europe, particularly, they did. Anybody with a grudge against you, anybody who hated Jews, anybody could report you. I put this teenager in Brussels in red. This teenage girl went to her parents in occupied Brussels in 1941. They were hiding a Jewish family. She told her parents she wanted an increase in her allowance. They told her there is no money. The father was working, but under the occupation, food was rationed, money was scarce. They were just getting by. And she was mad at her mother and father, and she went down to the local police station and reported her parents and told the Gestapo that her parents had a Jewish family in the attic. Her mother and father, fortunately, suspected that their daughter was going to do something awful, and they had already gotten the family out of the house. So when the police came to search the house, they were gone. But that's how dangerous it was. Your own child could report you. Passing as a Christian for Jewish people was very difficult, right? You had to know Christian prayers. You had to know how to behave in church. None of them had been in church. You had to know the language. For example, in Poland, if you're passing as a Catholic and you have fake papers, 3/4 of Polish Jews only knew Yiddish or had Yiddish as their first language. So they didn't speak Polish, or they didn't speak Polish well. And it was simple things like the police would come and hit you from behind as a surprise. Well, if you're a Polish Catholic, you would say, Jesus Maria, Jesus and Mary. But if you were Jewish, you would automatically say, Oy vey. It was something that small you could slip up on. So you really had to know the culture you were trying to pass through as a Christian. Now, people with a Semitic appearance, the Nazis had stereotypes of what Jews look like: large noses, dark hair, darkened skin. So you could be stopped at any time and asked for your papers on the street. The underground Żegota in Poland estimated it could take up to 10 people to be involved in the rescue of a single Jew, because you had to get food, you had to get papers. As simple a thing as if you're hiding someone in your apartment, or in your house or on your farm like the Ulmas did, what do? They can't use the public bathroom. A lot of apartment buildings on each floor had a public bathroom. They can't go there. Well, where are they going to go? You have to set up a bucket. You have to get that bucket emptied. You have to empty it when nobody's around, because they're going to ask you, what are you doing? Food. You have to get extra food. You have to have a storekeeper who's willing to cooperate with you. There's all kinds of things involved in hiding someone. Plus, nobody knew how long the war was going to last. Nobody knew. You know, D-Day doesn't happen until 4 years after the war began. Until 1942, a lot of people, including Jewish leaders, really believed that the Germans were establishing a Jewish reservation. That was the propaganda, that there would be a Jewish reservation created east of Lublin, where all the Jewish people could go and live, and they would be, quote unquote, protected. So they weren't aware that people were being killed, and certainly not, on the scale that people were dying. So again, finding shelter, food, how to conceal an apartment. What's really interesting is a lot of times Jewish people would go to a coworker or a neighbor and be turned down. And then they would end up with a complete stranger who would take them in. False papers. Constantly, people were stopped on the streets for papers. People's houses were invaded. Show your papers. You had to have perfectly forged papers to pass as a Gentile. Okay, Kennkarten. That was the German work permit, and it was also identification for adults. You had to make exact copies. So you had to have people who worked in a German-controlled government office, where you could get these papers forged. Anti-Semitism was really strong in Europe, and Nazi propaganda just made it worse. There was a lot of resentment of Jews that had been whipped up by years of Nazi propaganda. The Jews, by their very nature, were money hungry, corrupt, they're morally wicked, racially inferior. They support communism, they created communism, they create the Great Depression. It's their fault we're all poor. There was the blood libel, which was very popular, and you find that in the Middle East today, that claims that at Passover, Christian children are kidnapped and murdered, and their blood is used to make the matzah crackers that are used for Passover food. They are purveyors of bad morals. They invented pornography, all kinds of accusations. And the one the Nazis really tapped into was the Jews killed Christ. They tapped into this Lutheran and Catholic stereotypes of that. And I was in grammar school, and someone said that to me once, that the Jews killed Christ. And we had like several Jewish families on our street, I think 5 or 6. And I went home and I asked my mother that, and my mother was so angry. She said, the Roman soldiers killed Christ. You can't blame the Jews for that. So go tomorrow and tell him he's wrong. So I did. He didn't believe me though. Okay, Warsaw. So the Warsaw Ghetto comprised 4.5% of the territory of Warsaw. And it was a neighborhood that had been a mixed neighborhood, Jewish and Christian. 400,000 people were jammed into the Warsaw Ghetto. Because it had been a mixed neighborhood, there were 3 churches in the Warsaw Ghetto: All Saints, Nativity of Our Lady, and St. Augustine. Now, in Poland, because Poland had been in 3 different empires, Russian, German, and Austro-Hungarian, when Poland became an independent country, they didn't have a central registry office. And so what they did was, in independent Poland, you got your birth certificate from the religious community you were born into. And that's why baptismal certificates were so important. If you had a baptismal certificate from a Christian church, then that was all the proof that the Nazis asked for that you were Christian. So All the churches had to do this, not just the Catholics. Lutherans, Reformed, and Orthodox, they all had these registries. And so you had to have a baptismal certificate, that is dated from when you would have been born, not from 1939, right? Because they wouldn't accept that you converted, right? Because it's a racial war. It's not a religious war. So that's why the baptismal certificates show up. And in occupied countries and allied countries like Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, those governments would allow Jews to convert to Christianity. So if you had a baptismal certificate, that would save you. So baptismal certificates play a big role in the story. Now, in Warsaw and the big Polish cities, there were a number of Jewish people who were actually church-going Catholics. They had converted, their parents had converted, or their grandparents had converted. Because this is a racial war, all of these people who are of Jewish descent, ethnically, but are Catholic religiously, were imprisoned in the ghetto. The Jews in the ghetto were shocked when these Christian Jews come in. And it was a shock to the Polish population as well, because they didn't think in racial terms. They really thought in religious terms. A person is Jewish because they go to temple. A person is Christian because they go to church. And that's it. So this was a big blow, and it was a wake-up call. It was a blow to these Catholics because the vast majority of them had never been to temple. And most of them didn't see themselves as Jewish whatsoever. In the ghetto, a lot more people converted, but I don't think it was ever more than probably 7,000 or 8,000. But there were a large number of Jewish Christians. There are also Protestants in the ghetto, but they were a much smaller population. So these three churches are important to the story. So All Saints is the first one. Father Marcel Godlewski, he ended up hiding 100 people on the church property itself. And the church and the parish house were up against the wall of the ghetto. And so he and people from the underground arranged for false papers for at least 3,000 Jewish adults that we know of. These were not all Catholic, and the vast majority of them are not Catholic. In doing so, sneaking these people through, they got their papers from this underground group called Żegota. Poland was the only country where there was a national underground network founded specifically to rescue Jews. No other country had that. There were committees in different countries of small groups, but the Polish underground was completely organized around this Żegota. And the Polish government in exile in London would send money over. They would get it through couriers who parachuted in from Poland. And they came in with forged złotys, the Polish currency, or forged Reichsmarks, the German currency, in order to fund the rescue work. So he also had an orphanage. There were over 250 convents and monasteries of monks and nuns, mostly of nuns, who rescued Jewish children and put them in their orphanages. There were lots of orphans because of the war, because of the parents being killed, and also because of the disruption of families. And there were, the Germans wouldn't really look at a Catholic orphanage for Jewish children. Only a few nuns would know, usually, about the Jewish children. You had to be very careful, and the Jewish children had to be instructed how to pass as Catholics and so forth. The other priest in the parish was Father Anton Czarnecki. Now, he had been named by the Archbishop as a pastor for all the Jewish Catholics in the city. So he is involved in the rescue of another 3,000 to 5,000 Jews from the ghetto. The Żegota provided Kennkarten because they had people working in the German government offices. They provided false baptismal records and also smuggled them through the wall. Okay, he did this, which was pretty clever. He falsified death certificates of Jews that the Germans knew were in the ghetto. So he would issue the death certificate. They would no longer look for that person. So that took a lot of pressure off. And he would, because the priests could go in and out of the ghetto, he would find apartments along with Żegota where they could hide Jews that were saved. He was forced out in 1942 by the Nazis. And when he took the statue of Our Lady, which is quite large, out of the church and carried it through the streets of Warsaw to his new parish. And when he got to his parish and he set up the statue, the parishioners came to welcome him, and they found him like that. He was crying and had his arms around the statue. And they asked him, why are you crying? And that's what he said. She is the only witness to my children from the ghetto, the only one who saw what I saw. Because most people in Warsaw really didn't know everything going on behind the wall. The other parish was Nativity of Mary, Monsignor Severin Pawłowski, and he had 4 priests on his staff. They had a basement that they dug a tunnel out of. The area on the other side had been bombed heavily during the invasion, and so nobody lived there. So they could sneak people out at night because nobody walked through there. There was nobody rebuilding. The soldiers didn't go on patrol there. He stayed in Warsaw, and then he was shot in 1944. He also hid Jews in the church. And then St. Augustine. These 2 priests were very active in the rescue work, Father Franciszek Gonczarek and Leon Wieczkowicz. They saved 2,000 children with false papers. They smuggled children out to the Franciscan Family of Mary, which was a community of sisters that ran orphanages and boarding schools. They were betrayed. He was arrested and sent to the Gross Rosen concentration camp in Germany, where he died. Father Gonczarek survived the destruction of the ghetto, and he was given a new parish, and some extreme what we would call them alt-right today, these extreme right-wing Polish fascists who were anti-Semites actually shot him down at his church because he had saved Jewish lives. Now, again, you don't know who you're dealing with, who hates you for the work you're doing. On August the 6th is the Feast of the Transfiguration. On that date, all of the Catholic Jews who were still in the ghetto were rounded up. They were allowed to have a closing mass, and then they were all taken away. The Nazis liked to do stuff on holy days. They kept track of the Jewish calendar. They started the deportations of the Jews out of the ghetto on the commemoration of the destruction of Jerusalem, and they finished the deportation on Yom Kippur, which the Jews just celebrated a little while ago this year. After the war, one of the men that these 2 priests had hidden, Elias Finkel, he had survived. They hid him in the tower. He survived all the deportations and the Warsaw Uprising. And he came back after the war, and he paid for the restoration of the church after it had been. And this is what it looks like in 1944. That was the ghetto. And this is St. Augustine's. There's nothing left at all. Which I put that on just to show how pervasive the Nazi destruction was of Warsaw, because the whole city looked like this after the big Warsaw uprising in 44. All of Warsaw was just in ruins, but they didn't leave a trace of the ghetto, except for the ruins of St. Augustine's. Okay, in Poland, Lwów, that town in the south, the Armenian Rite had an archdiocese there that had been there for over 340 years. And so the bishop had died right before the war came, and Rome didn't have a chance to name a new archbishop for the Armenian Catholics. And when the Soviets came, they deported half of the Armenian population to Siberia, because a lot of the Armenians had their own businesses, or they were very active in Polish culture and Polish education. And this priest, Dionysius Kajatovinich, and his nephew, Father Kazimierz Romaskan, they organized a group within the Armenian Catholic Archdiocese and Żegota, and they issued baptismal certificates, or they would baptize Jews. Father Kazimierz Rashka, a third priest, he was very active in finding hiding places for Jews. And the Armenian Catholic priests read the pastoral letter, "Thou shalt not kill," which was issued in 1942, which we'll see in a couple minutes, at their liturgies in churches. And they announced to their people that anybody who was involved in participating in anti-Jewish pogroms or killing Jews or denouncing Jews would be excommunicated from the church. They would lose the sacraments. So they didn't pull any punches. Now, why the Armenians are important is they had a tight-knit community, so they knew each other. And they knew one another very well, and they could trust one another. Another priest, Father Leon Isakovich, and then this gentleman who ran one of the schools, Kajetan Isakovich, they helped to produce all these false papers. They both were caught, and they were both shot. Now, the Nazis said Armenians looked Semitic, so they constantly stopped Armenians on the streets for their papers. And this is where these priests came up with the idea. We give them all Armenian baptismal certificates, as many people as they could. And so the Jews easily blended in. They went to church on Sunday with all the other Armenian Catholics. When there was persecution of the Poles by Ukrainian nationalists, the Armenian Catholics took in the Jewish people with the false papers. So in the eyes of everybody around them, these were Armenian Catholics. So it was a clever thing to do. Ironically, when the Soviets come back in 44-45, they arrest all the people that were still alive that had been involved in this ring and accused them falsely of collaborating with the Germans and sent them to the Gulag for 10 years. The reason they did that was because these were people who showed initiative and who were very good at forging papers. And so they couldn't be trusted, and they were very active in the underground and in opposition and in independent Polish culture. So the Soviets weren't about to let them survive. This is Slovakia. So when Czechoslovakia was dissolved, after the West abandoned Czechoslovakia in 1938, so it was partitioned, okay? The territory that the Byzantine Catholic Church comes from, Carpatho-Ruthenia, was annexed into Hungary. And then a large portion of the rest of the territory of our church stayed in what became Slovakia. Hungary also annexed all these southern regions of Slovakia. Bohemia and Moravia became a German protectorate. And then this other territory is the Sudetenland, which was overwhelmingly ethnically German, and that was what Hitler had asked for in 1938, in which Chamberlain signed over to him. Unfortunately for the Czechoslovakians, the Sudetenland is also where the forts were. So once that was lost, they had no defense against the Third Reich. Now, Slovakia becomes a quasi-independent country. It was mostly Catholic, mostly Roman Catholic, with a large Greek Catholic, Byzantine Catholic minority, and a large Lutheran minority. Their president was a priest, Josef Tiso. Priests were not supposed to be in politics, but he was. That was rather common in Central Europe at the time. He ran this pro-fascist political party, and he was the president. Hitler said of him, "This wonderful little priest has given us all the Jews and even pays us to take them away." He wasn't a very good priest. The Slovakian Roman Catholic bishops didn't have the best effort in protecting Jews. When the deportations began, they had a pastoral letter read out in church, and then they had another one read out in 1943. But that one, the government said you have to read it in Latin. Well, no Slovak peasant understood Latin other than in the Mass, so that was pointless. They did it anyway, but nobody understood it, really. But in both letters, this is what they say, which is unfortunate. Baptism could be given by a priest to a Jew only if their conversion was sincere. They saw Jews, and put this in the letters, that Jews were economic exploiters and they were guilty of killing Christ. And the one big concession they made was they asked for humane conditions for the families that were being deported, because they saw them being loaded into these boxcars and hauled away. It was very obvious to everybody what was going on. So that was their big letter. And the message they gave to the priests was, you cannot baptize a Jewish person unless you know they really want to become a Catholic and will stay a Catholic. Why was that important? Because in Slovakia, if you had a baptismal certificate, you were spared and your family was spared. You could save up to 3 generations in one family with one person being baptized. So by these priests refusing to baptize, they're sentencing them to death. This was our bishop at the time in Prešov, Blessed Paul Peter Gojdich. He was a Basilian monk. And this is the bishop that our Knights of Columbus Council is named for. He did not wait. He was very active in rescue work. He was in a difficult position because President Tiso did not like Byzantine Catholics. He thought all Catholics should be Roman Catholics. He was quite nasty to Bishop Gojdich. Not only was there anti-Jewish racism in Slovakia, there was anti-Ruthenian racism in Slovakia. There was a lot of pressure put on our church government in Slovakia to not support the Rusin identity or Rusin culture, Rusin language, Rusin education, anything like that. And this other priest who later became a bishop and is also a blessed, Basil Hopko, was active in that and got in trouble for trying to defend this population. Gojdich issued a pastoral letter in 1939 defending the Jews and calling on the faithful to get rid of anti-Semitic attitudes. So he was really early, before the Germans ever came and before deportations ever began. And as I said, one baptism of one person in a family could save grandparents, parents, child. So it was very important. He personally saved 27 Jews in the bishop's palace that he hid there. And then he also hid people in the Sisters of St. Basil's boarding school. We know of at least 1,500 who were saved through the network of the Byzantine Catholic Church in Slovakia. This is the cathedral of St. John the Baptist, and the bishop's residence is over here. So what he would do when there was a roundup, because of course by 42, 43 Jews had to wear yellow stars on their coats. Whenever there was a roundup, he would come outside of the palace and he would walk up and down this big avenue that's there. And if he saw a Jewish person, he would go up and wrap his arms around them and say in a very loud voice, Slava Iisus Christou, which is the Christian greeting, glory to Jesus Christ, and then steer the person towards a residence, saying the whole time, why are you out on the streets? Don't you know there's an action coming? And take them into the residence. So he saved a number of people that way. The baptismal certificates, he would actually go to the train yard in Prešov with certificates and bang on the doors and yell at the Slovak guards from the Hlinka Guard, and he would yell at them, I have parishioners on this train, you can't take them. And with one certificate, he could take whole people out. Wojciech Kolenka had been his altar boy, and Wojciech Kolenka was a high-ranking civil servant. And he came to Bishop Gojdich because the Spitzer family that he worked for asked Mr. Kolenka to save their business, which they had to give up all their businesses to Christians. They said, we'll give you our business, because he knew the business and he knew them, and can you save us? And so he went to Gojdich. And Gojdich arranged for the baptism of one of the Spitzers. So Gojdich, we know, between him and the Redemptorist Fathers, we know of 533 Jewish people who were baptized as Greek Catholics, which saved 1,500 people and 249 families. There's probably more, but a number of people were killed in 1944, so we don't necessarily know everybody. Father Farkin Mankovic and his wife, they came up with a really clever idea, because the Germans learned, if they would look at a certificate and say, no, this is after the cutoff date, which was 1940. So that's new ink. So he and his wife experimented, and they created an ink that duplicated old ink from Austro-Hungarian times. And so they distributed that to parishes. And so the priests would write out these fake baptismal certificates in what looked like old ink on old paper. And then the person would say, oh, I was baptized in 19 whatever, but long before any of this became an issue. So it saved a lot of lives that way. The Redemptorist Fathers and Bishop Gojdich conducted public baptism ceremonies at the monastery in Michalovce. And he did that to show the people, you have to save a human life. The Sisters of St. Basil and Sister Servants of Mary Immaculate, they all took children, Jewish children, into their boarding schools and orphanages. And this is Gojdich's big motto during the war. Nothing's more important than saving a human life. He was honored just a couple years ago by Yad Vashem by this lady, Mary Ann Zach. She was a member of the Spitzer family. And she was baptized. The sisters took her into the school. This is Bishop Gojdich. These two priests are chaplains at the school, all the girls. And she testified to Yad Vashem that everyone knew who she was, and she was never treated any differently by students or nuns. Okay, Olshavice. This whole village, under their priest, Father Michael Masle, collaborated in hiding 100 Jewish people. And when the Slovak national uprising failed in 1944 and the German army occupied Slovakia, they were going to station soldiers in the houses of Olshavice, and they went to the priest. They said, well, you know where everybody lives and their conditions. You tell us who can take a soldier. Well, he fortunately knew everybody who was hiding Jewish people in their homes. So he had the soldiers quartered in other houses. So after the war, after communism, they couldn't do it after the war because the communists wouldn't let you talk about saving Jewish lives. This monument was unveiled in the early 1990s. It's the Byzantine cross and the Star of David. And the Jewish community erected this in Hebrew and in Slovak to thank the people of Olshavice for what they did. All right, Western Ukraine. That was the headquarters of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in what was then Eastern Poland. Its headquarters were in Lvov. The Metropolitan was Andrei Sheptytsky. His brother Clement was the head of this order, the Studite monks and nuns of Univ. There were also diocesan priests or eparchial priests. In 1942, he issued this pastoral letter that the Armenian Catholic priests used, "Thou shalt not kill," threatening excommunication to people involved in the killing of Jews or the denunciation of Jews. This was one of the eparchial priests who was involved in rescuing Jews. He was betrayed. He was arrested in 1943 and sent to Majdanek. He was a married priest, as most of our priests were at the time in Europe, and still are. And he, we know, gave out baptismal certificates to at least 600 Jewish people. He was put in Majdanek. His wife was trying to get him out. He sent her this letter. "I understand you are trying to free me, but I'm asking you not to do anything. Yesterday they killed 50 people here. If I were not here, who would help them to endure these sufferings? I thank God for his kindness to me. Apart from heaven, this is the only place I'd like to be. Here we are all equal, Poles, Jews, Ukrainians, Russians, Latvians, and Estonians. I'm the only priest here. I couldn't imagine what would happen without me here. Here I see God, who is the same for everybody, regardless of the religious distinctions which exist among us. Maybe our churches are different, but they are ruled by the same all-powerful God. When I'm celebrating the Holy Liturgy, everyone prays. Don't worry and don't despair about my fate. Instead of this, rejoice with me. Pray for those who created this concentration camp and this system. They are the only ones who need prayers. May God have mercy on them." And I gotta say, if I was in his boots, I don't know if I could have written that letter to pray just for them. But that's holiness. Archimandrite Clement, he and the nuns rescued 150 Jewish boys and girls that they put into their orphanage. And the adults, the parents, they disguised as monks or nuns because, of course, they all wore these big habits. And when the Germans would come, all they saw was monks and nuns. But they all had to learn how to behave in church, according to the Byzantine Rite. So, but it worked. They saved a lot of people. Metropolitan Andrei wrote to Rome, he wrote to the Pope that the German occupation was worse than the Soviet one of 2 years. He said, this is diabolical. Like Goydich, he hid Jews in his palace, including the sons of a rabbi. He guaranteed the families of the children that they hid that the children would not be converted, that they would be raised Jewish and they would be returned to Jewish families after the war, and if the families had not survived, that they would go to Jewish agencies after the war. And these three from the Studite order were very involved, Mother Olena and then these two priests, Fathers Stek and Timchin. Metropolitan Sheptytsky condemned the orgy of killing, that's what he called it, because of these constant massacres that were taking place in the towns. The chief rabbi of Ukraine said last year that Yad Vashem has to recognize him as a righteous Gentile. And the rabbi's children have tried to get him recognized. France is the last one we're really going to do. So France was divided because the French surrendered suddenly, much to everybody's surprise and the shock of the British, which is why you had the big evacuation out of Dunkirk. All right? They collapsed, and this became the free zone. This was occupied by Italy. This was occupied by Germany. This was to be colonized by Germany. This was Alsace, which was annexed to Germany. So the country was divided into all these zones. Jews were persecuted in the occupation zone by 1941. In the free zone, they willingly handed over Jews to be deported, and the French police were infamous for doing this. They happily collaborated with the Germans. So it was very bad in France, and it was very dangerous. But because there was such a very good underground network, 85% of the Jews in France survived. Whereas in Holland, it's less than 25% survived. So it's, when you can have a network. Père Jacques de Jesus is a Carmelite father. If you've ever seen the movie Au revoir les enfants, it's about him. He had a network that was putting Jewish boys in schools run by the Carmelite fathers. Someone reported him to Vichy authorities. They came to the school and took him and two of the boys. The movie Au revoir les enfants was made by one of the boys who survived from the school. And the title, Goodbye Children, are the last words. He said it's the last thing he said to us when the soldiers took him away with the two boys. He just turned and waved, goodbye, children. And of course, he never came back because they killed him along with all the others. Cardinal Saliège was very brave. He started denouncing what the Nazis were doing. He ordered his priests to denounce them from the pulpits, but then there were all these attacks that were happening, and he went to the headquarters and he tried to get them to stop. He tried to, in the name of humanity, and then he realized what he was up against, that this was not like World War I Germany, which was a Christian country. These people he was dealing with were nuts. And so he stopped the protests, and that's, again, why were there not protests throughout the war? That's why, because they were dealing with maniacs. And so then he put everything underground. He was in the Vichy zone. And after, his sermons were printed by the French underground and distributed on mimeographs or typed up by individuals, and were very, very popular in France because it called on people, to resist. So he had a very efficient network. Père Marie Benoit was a Capuchin friar. He got involved in rescue work because the Christian wife of a Jewish man came to him and asked for his help. And eventually he established a network that went through France and Italy. And he got the money from Pius XII, from Pius XII's own personal funds, as well as from the Vatican. So, responsible for saving many Jewish lives, he and Pius XII put together a plan in 1943. They had hired ships that would sail out of the Italian zone of France and carry the Jews to North Africa, where they would be safe. And right when they were getting ready to load people is when Italy pulled out of the war. And so the rescue never took place, and then they had to scatter these thousands of people across southern France and Italy, which was very hard to do, and a number of them were caught. He almost got caught. He had a reward for his capture, and so he had to go into hiding when he finally got to Italy. Okay, there were 9.5 million Jews in Europe, all right, in 37. All right, they were less than 2% of the population. Right? Of those people that survived, they were either in neutral countries or they had escaped out of the occupied zones before November 1941. The Nazis would not allow Jews to emigrate after November 1941. The Wannsee Conference is a couple months later where they decide to wipe them out. Rescuer stories. Why some people in Europe don't like rescue stories? Because it proves a lot more could have been done. Only 1% of Europeans were engaged in active rescue. That's not very many people. If you look at one priest could save 3,000 lives, if you had a lot more people involved in this, a lot more lives could have been saved. Yeah. And they were from all classes of life. You know, they were diplomats, priests, nuns, farmers, shopkeepers, housewives, teenagers, you know, anybody, athletes, workers, all kinds of people were involved. Anybody could have been involved in this. Catholics took action alone, like Mrs. Rybenczuk, or in large groups, like in Żegota. And they did this because, you know, they kept this verse in line. Male and female, he made them. In his image and likeness, he made them. You know, you can't hate people. You know, we are all made in the image and likeness of Almighty God. Another reason to do this is this. History is disappearing. You know, the survivors of the Holocaust who are around now are mostly people who were hidden as children. The adults, people who were adults, are gone. You know, the people that were in their 20s are now in their 90s. So we're down to the people who were teenagers and younger, and their stories, which is why a lot of places are making a point of filming survivors and filming their stories in order, and even creating these really impressive holograms of survivors where you can interact, asking the person who is now deceased, asking questions, all right, and they can answer questions. It's a very intricate program, but I was on 60 Minutes a couple weeks ago. I found that really impressive. Okay, and this is what I end with. So Hannah Kral was a Jewish child in the Warsaw ghetto. She was on the last train to Treblinka, and she was rescued off that train by men from Żegota. She was moved from house to house, and she ended up at the Albertine sisters, and they hid her until the war ended. Her entire family was wiped out. In the ghetto, which is going to show up here in a minute, the Umschlagplatz, it was a gathering place, is what it means in German. That's where all the Jews would be gathered together to be loaded into the train of boxcars that would take them to Auschwitz, Majdanek, or Treblinka. And after the war, she wrote a short story about the last deportation out of the ghetto. And she was not Catholic. She was from a religious Jewish family. So she imagines the scene in All Saints Church at the end of the Mass on Transfiguration Day, after all of the Jews have been taken. So she writes, when the Germans cleared the church of all the Christian Jews, there was only one Jew left in the church. He came down from the cross and called to the icon of his mother, Mame Kim, which is Yiddish for come, mama. And Mary came down, and they both went to the Umschlagplatz. And that's my point when I do these history presentations. You cannot, if we hate the other, we kill the other, we make fun of the other, you know, we allow hatred to fester in our hearts, and we forget who they are. Or we allow hatred to fester in the hearts of people around us because we don't stand up to them. And I think, you know, every time a person does that, Jesus says to his mother, Mama, come. You know, and he comes down from heaven and he suffers with those people that we have allowed ourselves to hate so much. And that's the end. Okay, if you have any questions. Yeah, clapping is nice. That's welcome. Okay. Were there any questions on there, do you know?
I'll let you know if any come in. We're on about a 5-second delay.
Oh, okay. Anything from you guys? Yeah.
I know that the Pope John Paul was kind of like young in there. Where does he kind of fit in?
So where did John Paul II fit in there? He entered a secret seminary in Krakow, and which was illegal. It was illegal to train seminarians in occupied Poland. So he was active in an underground theater group and cultural group, because he was an actor. And he was also a university student. He was taking part in what they called the Flying University. They would meet in different houses and apartments, never the same one twice. And he was active in the underground as a result. And then he discerned his vocation, and he went into the seminary program, which was in the basement of the bishop's palace in Krakow. Now, when the camps were liberated, there is a Jewish woman who collapsed from exhaustion and weakness and hunger. She was in terrible physical condition. And she was picked up by a young man who carried her to safety in 1945. And she never knew who it was until he was elected Pope. And she saw his picture, when he came out on the balcony, and then, all the media in Poland starts to show stuff, and on the networks around the world, pictures of him, younger, and she realized that she had been saved by him, because she would have died from exhaustion and cold. And so she wrote to the Vatican, and they actually met. And he said, "Oh, I don't remember. I don't think I did that." And she said, "No, I know you did." And one of his closest friends was a Jewish boy, Jerzy Kluger. And they reunited in Rome because the Jerzy Kluger didn't go back to Poland after the war because it was too dangerous. So, John Paul II was very, very sensitive to the Jewish people and the Jewish faith. He went to temple with Jerzy Kluger. Jerzy Kluger went to church with him. He went to Friday night Shabbat at the Kluger house. The Klugers came to, with him and his father and his brother. So, and that's why I think he was able to make such headway in Jewish Catholic relations because of this deep connection he had. And, as a seminarian, he saw nothing wrong with picking that woman up. He didn't go to get help. He just picked her up and carried her and got her to where she would be taken care of. So that's really a very good question. Okay. And Dan is going to go see if we have any, or we do. Okay. At the bottom. This may take you afield from topic, but can you speak for a moment regarding the role of the Catholic Church in the U.S. taking in repatriates and the escapees? Ooh. So it was hard to take in people in the United States, not so much because of the church, but because of the government. Pius XII asked all bishops to go to their national governments and ask for visas for what had to be called non-Aryan refugees, all right, which meant Jews, but they had to use the phrase non-Aryan. And bishops in the United States guaranteed that they would sponsor people in America to get them out of Europe, because it was the Depression, so you had to have a sponsor in this country. And our State Department was run by a man named Breckinridge Long, who was very anti-Semitic. He did not want Jewish people in this country, and he instructed all American embassies and consulates to hold up visas for Jews as long as possible and make it as hard as possible for them to get to America. So actually, the Catholic Refugee Agency had a really hard time helping people because they couldn't get them here. That's one of the great tragedies of World War II, because even when a courier got out from Poland, Jan Karski, at tremendous personal risk. He had gone into Auschwitz, and he got all the way across occupied Europe to England, and then the Polish government in exile sent him to America to talk to Roosevelt, to tell him what was happening in the ghettos and the death camps, because by now people are being murdered on an industrial scale. When Karski finished his presentation to President Roosevelt, Roosevelt asked him about the conditions of thoroughbred racing horses in Poland. He made no effort. He only brought in 1,400 in 1944, I think. 1,400 Jews from Italy were allowed to come to America. They were put in a camp in upstate New York. They had to sign an agreement that they would go back to Europe as soon as the war was over. So we made very little effort to save people. So the church was willing, and the church showed that after the war when the displaced persons came to America. But by then, Jewish agencies could help them. But it's not a bright spot in American history. If I roll it up, what does it go to another question, do you know? It might be the only one. Okay. That it? Okay, that's it. Good night. I'll be back in 2 weeks to do icons and what they are and how they're used, and unpack some of the messages that are in icons that we look at all the time. Okay, thanks. Yep.
I'd be very interested if you did something on Pius XII.
Okay.
You got a class on that?
Yeah, I can do a talk on Pius XII, and if people are still logged on, if you want that, please type that in or send me an email. If you're in the parish, let me know. Or you have my personal email and you're logged on elsewhere, let me know. Okay, because that's a really popular one that I do at Oasis.
It is.
What's that?
It's a great topic.
Yeah, it is. It's an important topic. Very important. Okay, thank you.